components of gluten sensitivity testing. There's three main types of tests that can be done. There's really more than that, but let's talk about a few. There's the blood. There are certain blood tests that can be done. Then we have a GI or a scope test that can be done, also known, sometimes referred to as a biopsy. And then sometimes doctors will run testing to look at antibodies in saliva. And then there's, we'll get to this in a minute, there's genetic testing that can also be done. And we'll talk about, about that as well. Let's break this down step by step. Number one, our blood tests. Now there are a number of different varieties of blood tests that doctors will order. And they're generally, specifically speaking, they're antibody-based tests. So these are oftentimes, what I mean by antibody-based is they're usually measuring IgG or IgA. These are different kinds of antibodies that your immune system will produce when it's exposed to something that it perceives to be a threat. So antibody testing. Examples of antibody tests are going to be directly, there's a protein called gliadin. And the test is an anti-gliadin antibody test. Okay, we also have something called endomysial testing. This is also an antibody test. We also have something called anti-tissue transglutaminase, also an antibody test. So again, we've got, these are the main options that that most people that have come to see me over the last close to 20 years have had these done. In essence, their doctor draws the blood, looks for anti-gliadin antibodies, anti-endomysial antibodies, and anti-tissue transglutaminase antibodies. Now, there's also, excuse me, there's also the biopsy, which is, the biopsy is actually a tissue sample taken from the small intestine. And we'll talk about that in detail here in just a minute. And then there's saliva. Saliva testing, sometimes doctors will run anti-gliadin tests in the saliva. Instead of using blood, they'll just use the saliva. These are typically IgA tests. So we look at kind of the gold standards that are commonly used in mainstream medicine to look at whether or not a person has a gluten issue. These are the predominant tests. So antibody testing in the blood, the biopsy tissue sample, and saliva testing. Now here's part of the problem. There are several problems related to these different types of tests, and research shows this. So what I'm telling you is largely research based. It's not my opinion by any stretch of the imagination. This is research based. Number one is that many people with gluten problems have IgA deficiency. So if we're using an antibody test that measures IgA responses to see if this person is reacting, but they have an IgA deficiency, we can get a false negative test result, meaning we get a result that comes back that's not really negative, but because the person doesn't make enough IgA, the IgA dependent test doesn't really give us an answer that's accurate. So we can get a misleading test representation. And so that's part of the problem. And there are many people that are IgA deficient. Now, the same thing can happen with IgG. We can get people that have immune suppression, and that's part of the problem with gluten. Remember what gluten can do is it can cause, over time, it can cause a reduction in immune strength and immune power. And so initially, it's kind of like diabetes. Ultimately, diabetes can cause an insulin deficiency, but initially, diabetes causes insulin to go up. Same thing with gluten. Initially, gluten can cause your immune system to become over-responsive, hence autoimmune disease. But over time, as that autoimmune disease goes on and continues to burn, the immune strength actually starts to suffer, and we can start to become antibody deficient. So if you're late in the game, what I mean by that is if you're 45 plus and you've been gluten reactive for a very long period of time, you're usually going to fall in this category. You're not going to fall in the category of high levels of antibody testing. You're going to fall into this category of your immune power has reduced over time, therefore the testing won't come back accurately. Now, so that's a problem just in general with antibody testing, and that goes for any of these tests. One of the other, let's talk specifically though about anti-gliadin. The gliadin test itself, choose a different color here. The gliadin test is a type of protein. Gliadin is a type of gluten. And it's only found in wheat, barley, and rye. It's not found in the other grains. So it's one type of gluten. Now, there was a study done in 2012 in Australia. It was a group of researchers identified 400 new gluten protein types that were not gliadin. 40 of them, 10% of these newly identified proteins, were more toxic to people with gluten sensitivity issues than gliadin. But most doctors won't measure those. They don't look at those other gluten type proteins. They only measure anti-gliadin, only found again in wheat, barley, and rye. So this is a subtype. It's oftentimes, this term gliadin is sometimes used interchangeably with gluten, but they're not the same thing. Remember that gliadin is a type of gluten, but it is not the only type of gluten. And it's only found in wheat, barley, and rye. So if you're reacting to corn gluten, for example, or the gluten in oats, the avenin, if you're reacting to the gluten in rice, or you're reacting to the gluten in some of the other cereal grains, this test won't tell you that. This test will only tell you whether or not you're reacting to a gliadin protein found in wheat, barley, and rye. But if you're not reacting to this protein specifically, then you can get a false diagnosis. You can get a false misrepresentation of what you reacted to in relationship to gluten. Because you have to remember this, at the end of the day, gluten is not gliadin. Gluten is a family of proteins found within the seeds of grass, not just gliadin. So this test is only specific to one type of gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye, when we know there are at least 400 different types of gluten. So these endomysial antibodies are another, again, going back up to what we know here, oftentimes these antibodies come back false negative because of this problem. Now, here's a caveat to this. If you've had these testing done and the result came back positive, it's a pretty good indicator that you are gluten sensitive. But a lot of doctors won't tell you that, because what a lot of doctors do is they combine blood testing with the biopsy, meaning they look at them together in tandem, and if you don't have a positive result here and here, then they'll tell you you're not gluten sensitive. So what happens to a lot of people is they can get a positive result here, the biopsy comes back negative, the doctor says, oh, you don't have celiac disease, because your biopsy is negative, don't worry about it. And that, again, is one of the other problems. So the anti-tissue transglutaminase, the anti-endomysial antibodies, the anti-gliadin antibodies, again, can all fall under this category of false negative test results. But they can also, even if they come back positive, remember that if the biopsy doesn't come back positive, oftentimes people are told to continue to eat gluten, and that's actually bad advice, in my opinion. So let's talk about the biopsy. I said before that it's a tissue sample taken from the small intestine. Well, why is that a problem? It's not. If a biopsy comes back positive, it's positive, meaning that it's a good indicator that gluten might be your issue, although we can get false positive biopsies, and here's what I mean. A false positive biopsy can come as a result of a parasite infection. A lot of people don't realize that, but celiac disease has another name, and that name is sprue. You ever heard this term? I'll draw it up here for you. Sprue is another name for celiac disease. Now, there's two different kinds of sprue. There's celiac sprue, and then there's tropical sprue. And tropical sprue is caused by parasite infection. And many doctors that do biopsies don't also simultaneously test for parasites. So having a positive biopsy for villus atrophy, which is what doctors are looking for, again, villus atrophy, which is damage to the folds of the lining of the small intestine. That's what they're looking for, that finding. That can be caused by parasites. And so if the doctor's not testing for parasites simultaneously, they can give you a misdiagnosis. Now, this can also happen, we've seen this happen as a result of the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So NSAIDs can oftentimes lead to a damage that's very similar to villus atrophy. We know that soy has been shown to cause villus atrophy as well. So again, if you're not being properly tested for other food allergens, if your doctor's not taking a good history on which kind of medications that you're taking. There's another class of medication called ARBs, angiotensin receptor blockers. These are blood pressure medications. And so these have actually been shown to cause the damage identical to celiac disease. So again, you can get a biopsy done, and if the result is positive, but the doctor's not ruling out all these other factors and kind of putting that all together, then what happens is you can be told that you have gluten sensitivity when in fact you may not. So again, although a test result can be false negative, it can also be false positive, and it's important for you to understand that. So, but here's the other problem with just depending on this biopsy. This biopsy is measuring tissue sample from the small intestine, right? Well, the surface area of the small intestine is the size of a tennis court. That's a pretty big structure. And when I take a biopsy, or when a doctor takes a biopsy, they're taking a microscopic cross-section. So, that would be kind of like walking out on a tennis court and picking up a microscopic piece of the court and saying that this piece of the court represents the entire court. And although you might get a false or a positive result, an actual positive result, you might get a false negative result. So this is where the biopsy can come back oftentimes negative, because the biopsy is a microscopic cross-section, and just because you have a biopsy that comes back negative doesn't mean you don't have villus atrophy somewhere else. If the doctor had taken the sample from another area of the small intestine, it's very possible we could have found that damage. But there's another problem with relying on this biopsy, is that sometimes the damage is not exclusive to the small intestine. There are a number of research studies that show that the damage can occur in the esophagus. The damage can occur also in the stomach, where we can get in the esophagus. There are a number of studies that link eosinophil infiltration. Eosinophil is a specific type of white blood cell, but eosinophilic esophagitis, which is where the eosinophils will creep into your esophagus, and the doctor will see that doing the scope. And so that can be an indicator of gluten sensitivity. It can be an indicator of other things as well. But again, my point in saying this is that the damage that doctors are looking for when they do a scope and biopsy, sometimes the gluten damage occurs in the esophagus, not in the small intestine. Sometimes the damage occurs in the stomach, not in the small intestine. Sometimes it occurs in the large intestine. And so, again, it's not exclusive to creating villus atrophy only in the small intestine. Now, there's also some research that shows that no gut damage is identifiable, and that gluten actually contributes to, let's draw a line over here, getting a little complicated, that gluten contributes to leaky gut, intestinal permeability, and that can, in effect, create systemic damage. So that can lead to, and I've seen this in my own personal experience with a number of clients, in that we see autoimmune arthritis, so arthritides, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, scleroderma, dermatomyositis, psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis. But we also see gluten as a neurotoxin. So it can affect the joints, it can affect the nerves. It's actually notorious for affecting and creating nerve damage. So we think, peripheral neuropathy, reflex sympathetic dystrophy, chronic pain syndromes. Some people, it affects the nerves in the brain, so it can cause brain fog, and it can create early onset dementias and other problems. So again, if we're looking for the damage here, but we're only looking for villus atrophy found only in the small intestine, but gluten can damage the esophagus, stomach, large intestine, leak across and damage other tissues in the body, and the villus atrophy damage that we know gluten can cause can be mimicked by parasites, NSAIDs, soy, angiotensin medications, angiotensin blockers, angiotensin receptor blockers rather. Again, these things all need to be ruled out, and this all has to be taken into effect if the doctor's doing this type of workup. And the same thing over here with the saliva. If we're running, again, a gliadin test that's IgA based, if you're IgA deficient, that can come back false negative. But also gliadin, remember, is only one subtype of glutens, of the family of gluten proteins that we've discovered. So this is what most people get in terms of mainstream diagnosis to look for, predominantly look for something called celiac disease. But remember, there's a whole category of diseases that gluten causes, and that's why we have this term. There's this term, it's oftentimes referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Because so many people say, my gluten's not that bad, I don't have full-blown celiac disease. I would beg to differ that gluten sensitivity, if it goes unrecognized creating autoimmune disease, it doesn't matter what autoimmune disease it creates, it's dangerous, it's a problem, it's a health issue. Would you rather have celiac disease or rheumatoid arthritis? Would you rather have celiac disease or multiple sclerosis? Like, pick your poison, because that, for a lot of people, they think, oh, I don't have celiac, therefore I'll cheat. Don't have that attitude. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, this term was actually coined by Dr. Marsh. Now, Dr. Marsh was the doctor who created the biopsy classification, the Marsh classifications for diagnosing celiac disease. He created this term because he knew that the biopsy was not a super accurate way to come about a diagnosis. So if you look up this term and type in Dr. Marsh, you'll find a lot of information on that particular topic. So again, blood tests can be inaccurate, biopsy can be extremely misleading, saliva tests can be inaccurate. So what's a person to do? How does a person know whether or not gluten sensitivity is an issue? That brings us to genetic testing. Now, why does that bring us to genetic testing? It brings us to genetic testing. Now, genetic testing doesn't really identify a disease state. A lot of people are confused. A lot of people think that gluten sensitivity is a disease. Gluten sensitivity is not a disease. Gluten sensitivity is a state of genetics, meaning you have the genes or you don't. And if you have the genes and you eat gluten, what ends up happening is your immune system will view that gluten as an enemy, and it'll create an inflammatory response. And that inflammatory response over time can create damage to your small intestine, but also damage systemically to other tissues in your body. So the best way, and actually it's interesting, is I think it was back in 2012, we've been doing genetic testing for gluten sensitivity now going on close to 20 years. But the Mayo Clinic in 2012 announced that this particular type of testing should be the new gold standard, HLA-DQ testing. So why do we want to do HLA-DQ testing? Let me draw you another picture and just make it help you understand it a little bit better. When we're looking at the cells, the surface of the cells have a receptor, and this is a very rudimentary drawing, but so this is a cell, immune cell, and then this is what's called an HLA-DQ antenna or receptor. I'll spell out receptor for you. And so what this receptor does, it's on the surface of your immune cells, and what this receptor does is it helps to identify things in the body that don't belong. So this receptor is kind of like the guardian, if you will. It looks at things and it says, that doesn't look like a healthy thing for the body to get exposed to, and it grabs onto it. And so there are certain genetic patterns. This receptor is produced as a result of two genes. They're called HLA-DQ genes. We have an alpha-1 and we have a beta-1 gene. And so what happens if you have a gluten-sensitive gene pattern is gluten, and I'll call this gluten right here, gluten will bind to that antenna or bind to that receptor, and that will create an immune response. And that immune response generally leads to inflammation. Now, you get exposure once or twice here or there, not a big deal, but if you get exposure on a regular basis, we get what's called chronic inflammation. And that's what many of these autoimmune diseases are. They're diseases of chronic inflammation. The body is being exposed repetitively to something it perceives to be a poison over time, creating more and more inflammation. Well, that inflammation builds and builds and builds until the body can no longer continue to put out the fire. And that's when the symptoms and the other types of diseases really can start to set in. So when we say that gluten sensitivity is a state of genetics, it's very, very true in that many people can develop disease as a result of gluten exposure, But gluten sensitivity itself is not a disease. It's the exposure that creates the chronic inflammation that leads to the disease. So that's why we want to know what the genetics look like. Because if we have a picture or an idea of what the genes look like, then instead of trying to hunt down different diseases, right, we can hunt down the genetic receptors. And if it's right for a person to go on a gluten-free diet, if it's the right move for them to make, that advice can be given and that advice can be adhered to. Now, some people would say, well, Dr. Osborne, you left out the most important test for identifying gluten sensitivity. What about the elimination diet? Let's see here. Let's write it down here. So, why can't I just do an elimination diet to see whether or not gluten is bothering me? Here's why. I mean, you can do an elimination diet, and some people do, and they feel better, but here's what an elimination diet won't tell you. Understand, some people feel better. If you haven't read my book, No Grain, No Pain, I talk about a lot of these different concepts in the book, but some people feel better when they cut grain out of their diet. And one of the reasons that you can feel better when you cut grain out of the diet is because you're cutting gluten out of the diet. So certainly one of the reasons is gluten. One of the reasons, though, because grain is oftentimes contaminated with mycotoxin, which is mold poison, mold toxins. Grains can also be contaminated with molds, and many people are allergic to molds. Processed breads oftentimes contain bromine, which is a dough conditioner that some people react to. We also have other substances that grain is processed with. One in particular, oftentimes referred to as meat glue. Its actual scientific name is microbial transglutaminase. Oftentimes your bread products are basically treated with meat glue, and that can make them act like gluten, even if they're gluten-free products. So like, for example, dairy can be treated with meat glue, and people with gluten sensitivity can react to the dairy as a result of the meat glue exposure. But again, meat glue can also be found in grains, and so you may be reacting to these things in the grains, but that's not all. We've got other things in grain as well, like pesticide. Particularly, many of you have asked me here in the past about things like glyphosate, about the Roundup, right? Which a jury trial in California just convicted the company responsible for producing Roundup for causing a man's lymphoma, which is a type of intestinal cancer. And so pesticides like glyphosate and other forms of pesticide, when you're eating grain-based foods or gluten-based foods, oftentimes these will contain those as well. Some of your grain-based foods are GMO, genetically modified. So we've got GMO as an issue. And some of them have additional food additives or preservatives or dyes. And of course, cutting them out, you might feel better. So and this is just a handful of reasons. There are many more than this, but this is an example of, if you do an elimination diet and you feel better, how do you know you're feeling better? Because of gluten, because of this, because of mold, because of meat glue, because of pesticides or GMO or food additives or bromine or whatever it is. How do you know which one it is? And the bottom line is it's hard to know. It's hard to know because it's hard to get grain that doesn't have one or more of these different components. Yes, you could buy organic grain, but that doesn't mean that it's not contaminated with mold or mycotoxin. Organic grain can still be contaminated. So again, if you are doing an elimination diet, you can't be sure whether or not if you feel better, that you're actually gluten sensitive because you feel better, or whether it was some of these other things. Or it could be gluten and some of these other things. So it can get complex. And this goes back to why I recommend genetic testing. Because if you know that you should avoid gluten, and you know it's genetic in nature that if you eat gluten, your body perceives gluten to be an enemy, then you can take a proactive diet approach and change your diet. Versus not knowing and trying gluten-free out. And what happens when most people try gluten-free out is they don't go on a gluten-free diet, they go on a modified gluten-free diet, or what I call a traditional gluten-free diet, where they're avoiding wheat, barley, and rye, but they're not avoiding the other grains that also contain glutens and other problematic issues. Another scenario, some people don't go on a no-gluten diet, they go on a low gluten diet. So they've reduced the quantity of gluten exposure, but they haven't eliminated it, and not knowing because they're not taking it seriously enough because they haven't been properly educated. Gluten can cause damage at 20 parts per million. So that's not a very, very heavy dose. It can cause an inflammatory response for up to 2 months. So if you're trying to overcome a chronic autoimmune inflammatory problem and you don't even know whether or not you're gluten sensitive and you're not taking the diet seriously enough, you may never ever overcome that illness because you get enough exposure consistently enough over time to continue to contribute to that chronic inflammation and to that illness, as it were. So again, here's your rough basic breakdown. I tried to simplify it for you and make it as easy to understand as possible.